2 minutes. For those who've already joined us, we are waiting 1 more minute for everyone to arrive, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Forum on Arms Trade and Center for International Policy webinar forum, virtual forum. I'm not sure what we're calling these things anymore. Anyway, it's a gathering of experts on the ramifications of the Ukraine war and how that war is impacting the Middle East. I am Sarah Yeager. I'm Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Thank you to Jeff Abramson for pulling this together. To the Forum on Arms Trade and to CIP for having us here today and for sponsoring this. I want to just briefly tell you who we've got here, and then we'll get into the substance. So we've got Nancy Okail. She is President and CEO of the Center for International Policy. I am not going to go through all of these amazing bios. You can find them in the invite and online. We've got Andrea Prasow, Executive Director, the Freedom Initiative, and we've got Merve Tahiroğlu. Yes? Okay, basically, Tahiroğlu, the Turkey Program Coordinator for Project on Middle East Democracy, what we all call POMED. So let me take care of a couple housekeeping things. We've got an hour and a half with you, which is a really good amount of time to dig into these issues. We're going to have a question and answer. You can raise your hand or you can put your questions into the chat box, which I will be monitoring. If you raise your hand, I will call on you and you'll be able to ask your questions. We're going to go through, I'm going to ask each panelist to talk a little bit about the tentacles that they see coming out of the Ukraine war and impacting the Middle East. And I'll just ask them for kind of a 30,000-foot view of what they're seeing, and then digging into perhaps some of the cases that they want to offer. I will then go back to them and ask for practical recommendations for US policymakers. And I say practical because I think we can all kind of look at problems like these and offer really vague, wonderful recommendations that we hope in the real world would or perhaps in our dream world would make some kind of difference. But I'm going to ask them for really practical things that US policymakers can do so that if you are in fact a US policymaker attending this virtual gathering, you can leave with something that has teeth. You know, when Jeff asked us to do this panel, I was thinking about history classes that I took in high school or in college, and how it is so easy to see that something happened. You know, there was a shooting on a bridge in 1914, and suddenly there's a world war. And you see all of these dominoes fall, and you see the events happen, and you can see the linkages between them, and it all makes so much sense. And yet, when something happens in real life, in real time, like Russia invades Ukraine, it is very hard from where we sit in this real world to see all of the ramifications of what that means. And I think for policymakers in particular, but for those on the outside too, it's hard to plan for what those ramifications are, what comes next. The food insecurity, the rising gas prices, inflation all over the world, weapons proliferation, refugee flows. I think some of this we could have predicted, but some of it not. And some of it we're watching play out in real time, and we have to respond to it. We are here, Nancy and Merve and Andrea and I, as people who care very much about human rights, who care very much about the third order effects, as the military would call it. So the things that we haven't been able to predict, but that will impact real people. And the way that I'm looking at this is, I'm doing a Venn diagram here. This is, Ukraine and the conflict there. This is the Middle East. This is US foreign policy, and this is weapons and sales. All of those four things, if you kind of line them all up, there is this nexus. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The two things that I just want to flag having to do with the Middle East. One is that so much of the US policy apparatus is focused on Ukraine. Are they really paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East? Now, we know that some people are. We know that President Biden has re-engaged the Middle East in ways that appear to be very strongly linked to the Ukraine war, to get lower gas prices, to stop Russia from being able to sell its weapons and get back its economy. So we're seeing some of the ramifications of that in the Middle East as we speak. But the rest of the US government apparatus, all of those policymakers, are they paying attention to what is happening as a result of the Ukraine war? That's a question. The other question is, in order for, and this is directly to the weapons question, in order for the United States to stop Russia from reconstituting its economy through weapons sales, I heard from a defense official the other day that the United States is looking directly to those partners that Russia used to have in order to increase our weapons sales, US weapons sales to them. And of course, many of those Russian partners are some of the worst human rights abusers in the world. So how does US policy then ensure that it is not going to be empowering human rights abusers around the world in order to deal with Ukraine? These are some of the questions that I have that I think we'll dig into today, but I know that Andrea and Nancy and Merve have their own questions that they are trying to answer. So with that, let's go to Andrea first, and then we will go to Nancy, and then we'll go to Merve, and I will kick it off to Andrea now.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to Jeff and to our hosts for organizing this event. It's lovely to see so many women on this panel. As we all know, foreign policy, particularly in Washington, is not as diverse as any of us think it should be. And because of that, it isn't as good as it could be. So I'm pleased to see some diversity here and no fears of a mantle at play today. I'm excited to talk about this question because I think it's a really essential one. And speaking of diversity in foreign policy, one of the things that I know many of us have found frustrating over the years since the conflict, this latest conflict began, has been this conversation about how this conflict in Ukraine is fundamentally different from any other type of conflict that we've seen before. We hear that from US policymakers, we hear that from human rights activists, we hear that really from everyone. And to a certain extent, I think every conflict is unique. So to try to find identical ones and compare is probably not helpful. You could always choose the conflict you're looking at and describe what makes it unique. But in many ways, the conflict is not unique because Putin practiced this. He practiced it in Syria. Other countries like Saudi Arabia have practiced a similar form of a conflict in Yemen and elsewhere. What I think, in my personal view, what is unique is that the primary victims of this conflict have been white, and that they have that they match an understanding of what many educated Americans understand to be people worthy of, treated as worthy victims. So they're people just like us, as people would say. That could be my daughter in the stroller, that could be my mother who's stuck behind in the apartment building. And I think we know a lot. I'm not a psychologist. We all know a lot about human nature. People identify with the victims and feel like there's something different. But the overarching view, I've told people this before, it was publicly recorded to Senator Kerry. Former Secretary Kerry was at Doha Forum a few months ago, and he spoke about Ukraine, and he said, "I've never seen any conflict so horrific, and I was in a war." We all obviously know about his experience in Vietnam. And I found that so shocking to hear that description, the idea that what was happening in Ukraine, which is horrible, is so fundamentally different even from the horrors of Vietnam. I think objectively that's not true, but I think it's really important that we be aware of what's going on in people's minds as they look at the conflict. So when we look at decisions the US might make to say, this is so dangerous that we must shift our orientation, some of that is what is really undergirding what I think is a shift in US policy. So, I mentioned Saudi Arabia and Yemen. What I would like to talk to you primarily is the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. The Freedom Initiative is an organization that focuses on political prisoners in the Middle East, primarily in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And we have watched this conflict very closely with a lot of concerns about the US reorientation towards Saudi Arabia. And in some ways, I would say that Ukraine was a trigger, but it's also an excuse. I don't think that the US was really a reluctant actor when it comes to turning back towards Saudi Arabia and towards the Middle East. And in many ways, I find this ironic because MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is actually a lot like Vladimir Putin. And his approach, at least to the war in Yemen, was a lot like Putin's approach, which is to engage in this aggressive foreign policy, keep information at a minimum domestically in order to garner domestic support. Of course, as I said at the outset, every conflict is different, every situation is different, but for many years, it seemed like MBS was really sort of modeling himself after Putin. And the war in Yemen has, I think many of you know, been utterly devastating to civilians, to all Yemenis, but in particular to civilians. And the US has sold weapons and participated in a variety of ways to support that conflict throughout the entire time. A recent GAO report, the Government Accountability Office, from this past June indicated that DOD, the Department of Defense, has administered at least $54.6 billion of military support to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates from 2015 through 2021 fiscal years. And that report indicated the need for greater end use monitoring, which is something I think we will be discussing later on in the recommendation section. But, when I talked about, I think that highlights for me that in so many ways, MBS has been like Putin, but what's different is we've seen this near universal condemnation of Putin's foreign policy. But when it comes to MBS, $54.6 billion is an awful lot of money for only the US to be sending to the Saudis in support of this conflict. So we definitely see a different posturing, this notion that Putin is a real threat. MBS, Saudi Arabia, what's happening in the Middle East is not the type of serious threat that the US needs to be worried about when it comes to Americans. And I think that that's sort of where we see the difference, the US feeling like what Putin does with respect to Ukraine could somehow reach us. But what MBS is doing to his own people or to the entire country of Yemen, that doesn't reach us. And that sadly brings me back to sort of how I opened, which is that I think there's a lot of othering of victims when it comes to US foreign policy. And we really see that play out now. So I'm sure everyone here knows that in connection with the war in Ukraine, in connection with a conversation about fuel prices, Biden ultimately went to the Middle East recently and did meet with MBS. I'm just going to do a check. Sarah's frozen for me, but I see my other panelists moving. Am I still coming through okay? Okay, hopefully we'll get Sarah back. So President Biden went to the Middle East, engaged in a fist bump with MBS, which we've all seen, the fist bump seen around the world, which was incredibly troubling, though I will note that I think, I mean, coming from a human rights organization, what pleased me about the coverage of that fist bump was that there was coverage of the fact that it was a fist bump and the fact that Biden had this meeting with MBS. I think if human rights organizations and journalists hadn't spent time really sharing the real story of human rights in Saudi Arabia with the public, that might have gone unnoticed. You know, Biden goes somewhere, shakes someone's hand or doesn't, wouldn't be the massive news story that it was. But because we spent time really laying the groundwork for the abuses by MBS, I think it was so noticeable. So, you know, Biden went on this trip, reportedly raised the lack of accountability for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I think, again, probably people watching this panel know that the US government determined itself, the DNI determined that MBS must have known, if not directly ordered, the killing and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. So to see the US president go and engage in this fist bump, you know, have this meeting was really a real blow, not just for human rights activists like myself here in Washington, but really, you know, essentially gutted a lot of people who have family members who are in prison in Saudi Arabia or who were victims themselves of human rights abuses there. So, you know, that will lead me to some recommendations later. But what for me, what is most troubling is that the US government has positioned that trip as a re-engagement and to a certain extent, a warming of relations that should theoretically allow the US as a now closer ally to Saudi Arabia to push Saudi Arabia for reform. But instead, we have seen, and you know, we can't draw a direct causative line, but we have seen a tremendous crackdown. Many of you have seen this in the press. I'm going to start with today's news. The Guardian reported that a Saudi woman was sentenced to 45 years in prison for using the internet to tear Saudi Arabia's social fabric. So essentially using the internet. Many of you have seen the last 2 weeks the news about Salma al-Shahab, 34 years in prison because she tweeted in support of women's equality. And you know, I have a list of cases I won't go into now because of time, but all really disproportionate or just utterly, you know, unlawful, very lengthy sentences of human rights activists or just people engaged in what should be protected activity. All of that since President Biden went to Saudi Arabia. So again, I don't have the causative line, but what I can tell you is that MBS certainly didn't respond to that visit with some kind of direction to, in this case, a specialized criminal court, which is largely controlled by the royal court, that the US is demanding something different and that Saudi Arabia should respond. You know, to the contrary, we've seen no changes whatsoever, at least not that our, you know, the human rights organizations have been able to track, that our contacts in the country have been able to track, which really represents a real failure of US foreign policy, at least at this stage. And at the same time, and I think my other co-panelists will discuss this, we haven't seen any shift in Saudi policy that would help, for example, with US domestic fuel prices, with the actual conflict in Ukraine in terms of, you know, maybe shifting Saudi Arabia away from China and so on. You know, we've just seen MBS carry on business as usual, but now with the added imprimatur of a US president's visit along with his prominent fist bump. So I'm sure I'm over time at this point. I will stop there and look forward to questions and comments from my co-panelists and from the audience. Thank you.
Andrea, thanks so much. And just to note, we did, as a coalition of NGOs, ask for President Biden to meet with human rights defenders from the region before he met with MBS and President Sisi and the Bahraini King and the rest. We never heard back on that request. So we are
This is Jeff Abramson in the background here. Sarah is having trouble and said she'll call in from the phone, but let's turn it over to Nancy now.
All right. Well, we hope to get Sarah back because I love the way that she's framing the issue and the important questions that she is putting. And I'm very grateful for Andrea and the way that she framed the issue, portrayed the different human rights violation in Saudi Arabia, which I don't think if anyone knows what's going on in the Middle East see this as different than what has been happening over time and what's been happening all over the Middle East. But I just want to take a step back to look at, is this different, what we're seeing right now? And ask the question of, first of all, why the US engages with the Middle East, how it engages with the Middle East, and if what we're seeing right now is a progress or regression or just like the status quo, business as usual. And I think it's important to just like look at, to begin with, on how the US perceive the Middle East. And I think this is where the problem begins, that it's always looking at the Middle East as this special place. And every time something happens, it's an anomaly that we're going to get over with and then get back to where we are and disengage. And every time there is a certain, whether international or regional event, it's always treated as a special circumstance that we are there temporarily for 20 years, and then we're going to withdraw and get back where we're. It differed if we look just, let's take the past 20 years and the reasons why the US was engaging or getting close to the Middle East. Well, if we think of 9/11, we think of the Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS. I mean, not that there is a causation there, but they happened back to back or almost at the same time. And then we have Ukraine. Look at those three special events. One happened on domestic land in the US, one happened in the region, and one happened in Europe. And all affected the way that the US engages, or the need to engage with the US in one way or another, where troops are on the ground or selling arms or any other form, or even an invasion. But if you look at the issue and how it's being placed and framed, an event in the US, an event in the region, an event in Europe did push or sort of frame the way that the US engages with the Middle East, which means that if it tells us anything, it's not really a special case that makes the US engage with things. It is a region, like any region, that the US would and should and sometimes have to engage with. The question is how to engage. And the question is, like with everything that Andrea explained, this is like the human rights violations and atrocities in Saudi Arabia, which is similar in Egypt that we are seeing right now in an unprecedented way. How does that differ right now than in the past? And the short answer is not much. Whether we're talking in terms of arms transfers, whether in terms of strategic interest and US edge over other countries, or whether we are talking about the other end that is like usually the umbrella for everything is the promotion of democracy. Let's take the arms trade. We'll see this year so far, the biggest recipients in the world of US arms are Indonesia and Poland, for obvious reason. And then we see top following three are Egypt, Jordan, UAE, and then followed on the sixth rank is Saudi Arabia. So in terms of even looking at the comparison of two presidents who are at odds with each other, like the Trump era and Biden's era, which is like coming at least with the political intention of reversing the policies of Trump towards the Middle East, nothing much has changed. And there's always this excuse that there are special circumstances. The circumstances right now is the oil prices and the war in Ukraine. But it actually did not differ much. Egypt in January 25th had the deal of the $2.6 billion for the helicopters. And then we had the $2.2 billion deal of the C-130, the super aircraft. The trade with Saudi Arabia, if we compare last year, it was $1.15 billion of arms sales, FMS. This year, so far, and it's not even a full year, it's $3 billion. So you see it's even doubled than, or more than double than it was in 2021, the entire year. So that in terms of trends of arms sales. So nothing much has changed, whether in terms of framing, there's always this special circumstances, or in terms of intent. And that doesn't tell us that there isn't much difference between the Biden administration or the Trump. There's a huge difference, but it tells us that changing these trends requires more than just changing a president. It requires a change in the power structures that allows for the perpetuation of the situation as it is. Now, let's come to the other strategic goal of selling arms and engaging further with the Middle East. Let's compare with China, for example. So according to the Defense News website, if we look at China's trade and sales, arms sales to the Middle East, comparing the period between 2012 and 2016 and the period between 2017 and 2021, the sales to Saudi Arabia has increased by 290%. And the sales to UAE has increased by 77%. That these are maybe sales of drones and others aerial types of weaponry. In addition, we're seeing that Biden went all the way to Saudi Arabia and the trip to the Middle East, particularly maybe for the oil prices. And a lot of experts would tell you that even that change that happened is tenuous and it's not that significant. But then also it's not very special to the US, because we are seeing that there's within days, there's the anticipated trip of the Chinese president to MBS. And one of the terms that are being propagated, talked about in the media, that it is about the oil exports and it is about selling oil to China and being paid in Chinese currency instead of dollars. So this is again one-upping what the US was trying to achieve from this sale. In addition, of course, apart from the oil, apart from the arms, China's the size of trade between China and Saudi Arabia in 2021 was around 87 billion, which is 17% of the share of the total trade. So again, we're looking at framing. It hasn't changed that much. It is always there's special circumstances. Trade, we are seeing that the trends are almost the same, if not increasing. Now let's come to the issue of promoting and supporting democracy, because the overall support for Ukraine, which they do need, is basically we are in a fight for democracy. And now I think there is an overall confusion between two ideas, or the connection between them. That fighting a dictator automatically means that we're fighting for democracy, or it is presented as such. But that's not the case. I mean, the fall of Saddam did not mean that there's a democracy that were put in place in Iraq. The fighting of Putin does not necessarily that we're propagating or fighting for democracy in the rest of the world. I think if you look at everything that Andrea has mentioned, that does not all the atrocities, the jailing of women activists and scientists and all this, in addition to what's happening in Egypt as well, that many of you know of, it does not mean that if we are claiming that this fight is a fight for or against a dictator or against an authoritarian regime does not mean directly that we are putting in place or supporting democracy. And if any of us have seen the news yesterday in Iraq, 20 years after the invasion, 12 people dead, and there are clashes are erupting, going into the green zone. Muqtada Sadr is announcing that he is withdrawing. Certainly does not give you that message that the goal out of this is to achieve democracy. The same thing if we look at Egypt, we're looking at Libya. And just to sum up this part of what the point I'm trying to make is that in terms of the look and the vision of the Middle East as this essentialized special place that we only go to under special circumstances is a completely distorted vision. The view that things would change with just by changing a regime or a president is also, a false observation, even if we look at just trends of the arms transfer. If it's for the strategic edge of the US over other countries, we're seeing, just to compare, there are so many other comparisons, but just to compare China and the US and arms sales to the region, you would see that. And then finally, the overall moral stand and support for democracy, it doesn't look like that if you've heard what Andrea said, and if you look at the news of what's happening in Egypt and the jailing. And for example, just to give you one example, it's been 10 years since the case that I was indicted to and sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2011. The case is still open, and the case still have the best and most prominent civil society organizations, leaders in Egypt that are either banned from traveling, having their assets frozen, and they're not allowed to work, and some of them are being prosecuted and harassed continuously. So just to close this part before we go into the practical ideas, we are engaging with the Middle East. Let's think of practical ways to make such an engagement at least as harmless as possible for the people who live there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Appreciate that. And Joshua, you have a great question in the chat. I encourage my fellow panelists to look at that question. I think we'll probably get into that. So Merve, let's go into the specific case of Turkey. Why don't you offer us your insights on that?
Of course, thank you, Sarah, and thank you again for the Forum on Arms Trade. And I think the Center for International Policy is also sponsoring this event. So for having this event in general, it's very timely. And I agree with a lot of the points that have already been made by Andrea and Nancy. I want to echo some of them with regards to Turkey. I think one of the big disappointments that we're seeing with Turkey, but also in the region, is also this idea of, the continuation of, US policy decade after decade from under very different presidents, which is always basically the same. And I think that is, always relegating democracy and human rights to a second or third degree issue, and, prioritizing what seems to be U.S. assessment of security interests over these other issues. And I think the Ukraine war and its impact on Turkey and Turkey's relations with the West very, captures that really well, that dynamic. The most important thing, impact of the Ukraine war with regards to Turkey has been, it's really changed the way NATO allies and the West has been approaching Turkey and Erdogan. As most of you watching this, I'm sure know, Turkey has been undergoing massive changes in the last 20 years. More so in the last decade. It has become increasingly more authoritarian at home. Abroad, it's becoming more aggressive, more assertive, trying to assert its independence. And in many ways that translates into foreign policies that are deemed problematic by Turkey's NATO allies. And all of Turkey's NATO allies, including the US, has been very much aware of this trend, and they've been approaching Turkey cautiously, especially since 2017. 2016 when Turkey bought a Russian advanced missile defense system, the S-400s, which pretty much showed Turkey's Western allies that the country is seriously drifting towards this other direction abroad, and that is very much connected to the internal changes with regards to, human rights abuses and the anti-democratic turn that Turkey had taken before then. But since the beginning of the war, of the Ukraine war this year, we're seeing a very different attitude. It's almost like NATO allies, including the US, have suddenly decided that Turkey's strategic importance as a security ally, as a security partner, is very important, and we cannot lose Turkey. And specifically from the Biden administration, the new thing we're seeing is this push, newfound interest that the US should be selling F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. This particular arms deal has been in discussion since last year, way before the war, but the administration seemed to have a sudden interest in moving forward with the sale only after the Ukraine war, and similar meetings have taken place. Other NATO allies have also shown more interest in selling, arms and weapons to Turkey since the beginning of the war. I think the idea that all of these countries have, and the same sense in Washington, is that suddenly we're facing this, aggressive Russia. It's not sudden, but it's, pretty intense since the beginning of the war. We're seeing this aggressive Russia, and we need to keep as many countries on our side of the equation as possible. And so let's try to placate them or make them happy with all these arms sales. So I think that's a very problematic approach. This is pretty much the approach that the US has been, I think, taking for the last many decades. Biden, when he, took over the administration, made, of course, a different promise, right, to his constituents, to its voters. He said that he wanted a foreign policy that would put human rights and democracy first. And even with the Ukraine war, he has been framing the issue as this is a fight of democracies against autocracies. But of course, he has gone on to recruit quite a number of dictators into that war, which completely undermines that framing. And Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they're all one of them. Turkey is a bit of a different case because it is a NATO ally. So it's a little bit different than these other countries, but I still think this idea of selling F-16s to Turkey and suddenly giving Erdogan the meetings that he wants, etc., all of this policy change is a big mistake and very problematic. I just want to quickly run over, a couple of reasons why I think that's problematic. I know I don't have that much time, and we want to go into recommendations, but I mean, I've already, I think, explained why I think this whole framing is bad, and approaching, arms deals to these countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, in order to keep them, on the side, in the Ukraine war and not let them fall into Russia's orbit, is highly problematic because of, the hypocrisy it has, but also because I think it's based on this idea that we can change these countries' behaviors by selling them arms. And I think that's a huge mistake, especially with President Erdogan. When we look at him as a case, I mean, Turkey is formally neutral in this war in Ukraine. It does help Ukraine quite a bit. It sells armed drones to Ukraine. It has also donated a few of these drones to Ukraine. It, it has struck a deal together with the UN to help Ukraine resume its exports. And it is able to do these things because of its neutral role in the war. So those are some good things, but it also has some problematic policies. It has not stopped being a friend to Russia. It still has strong economic ties with Russia. It might just go ahead and buy more S-400s or other weapons from Russia in the future. And the US in particular is very concerned about Turkey becoming this place where Russian oligarchs effectively evade US and international sanctions on Russia. And I think none of that behavior is going to change because Biden sells Erdogan a bunch of F-16s. And so to think that can, lock Turkey in to the Western orbit, I think is highly problematic and just not realistic. Another reason why this is problematic is, Turkey has used its role in NATO, its relationship with the U.S., much like some of the other countries that we've been seeing, as a way to get, concessions for itself. And, most recently, we've seen this F-16 issue come to play in the last NATO summit in June. One of the roles that Turkey has as a NATO ally is, allowing other countries to join. And of course, one of the major policies that the U.S. has been trying to accomplish with the Ukraine war is allowing the accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO. So showing a united front within NATO, expanding NATO, showing Putin that he won't be able to get away with these kinds of acts, and there's strong unity within the organization. And Turkey stalled the process and is still stalling the process of Sweden and Finland's accession into NATO. The Biden administration says there's no connection between this and the potential F-16 sale, but Erdogan changed his mind effectively about whether to veto the accession of Finland and Sweden after 2 months of back and forth at the very last minute at the NATO summit in June, and soon after he decided to give the green light and sign a deal, President Biden himself came out and said that that he is thankful to Turkey and he's very much supportive of selling F-16s. So in the eyes of, I think, Turkish observers and the Turkish government, these things very much do seem linked. And it looks like the US is trying to, use this F-16 sale to try to get Erdogan to behave properly in NATO, not fall into Russia's orbit, maybe not help Russia evade sanctions, all of these things, which I think the F-16s won't actually accomplish, and it's problematic to think this way. And I know I'm running out of time, but very, very quickly, finally, I think the most important reason why this whole approach is problematic is human rights and democracy in Turkey right now. Turkey is going through a pretty extraordinary time. There's a devastating economic crisis, and there is a pretty highly contentious election coming up just next year. What that means in a country that's pretty autocratic like Turkey is that in the next year, as the election approaches, Erdogan is going to become more and more repressive at home. And I think he's going to be more and more aggressive abroad, and we will see that moving forward. But we're in this precarious time over the next year. And I think if the US moves forward with something like an F-16 sale to Turkey at this time, it will be a huge boon to Erdogan. And, all of these actions going to Saudi Arabia, engaging with, Sisi, selling weapons to Erdogan, all of these things really embolden autocrats and give them, make them think that they have a green light, that they can behave as, as they wish at home and abroad. And so I think it would be a huge mistake for the US to do that at this time, just because it is singularly focused on Ukraine. I'll stop there and pick up in the second round.
Thanks, Merve. One of the things I wanted to note before I got frozen out of my own internet connection was that I think you heard that we had asked President Biden to meet with human rights defenders from the region. And have not been able to secure that meeting. And we're also trying to get funding directed to human rights defenders from the region. We are trying a bunch of different things to mitigate as much as we can the human rights ramifications of this re-engagement with the Middle East. One of the things that I appreciated in the chat and the questions is the term realpolitik. That's something that we are all talking about right now. When Andrea and I were at Human Rights Watch together right after the election of President Biden, we were watching him get up there on the dais and say, human rights will be a central priority. It will be a priority for U.S. foreign policy. It'll be at the center of U.S. foreign policy. And I know I couldn't have been happier. And then as the weeks rolled on, we saw time after time after time that it was realpolitik all over again. And it was transactional policy. And I think, we had been watching that happen consistently. And then Afghanistan happened, and then Ukraine happened. And when Ukraine happened, we really saw this play out, where human rights requests of these countries for Biden to go visit wasn't even on the table. And in fact, it seemed like US influence, you've heard my fellow panelists talking about this, the amount of arms and security assistance that is given to some of these countries like Saudi and Egypt is so massive that in fact, you would think the US would have enough influence at that point before the visit of President Biden to Jeddah to say, hey, can you lower gas prices? We're giving you a bunch of security assistance, or to make human rights requests. And we didn't see that. So I guess I want to ask Andrea first. And what I'm going to do now is kind of take the questions and weave in asking you all about your recommendations. I want to ask you, we saw this amazing rhetoric. We had this great discourse about human rights and democracy. And now what we're seeing is this, I really think it is realpolitik. And what the US officials are saying is that it's engagement. The only way to change these leaders and their policies is to engage with them. Do you see that playing out, especially after this big visit? And if whether you do or you don't, the engagement isn't going to stop. So what are you recommending US policymakers actually do to once again live up to their rhetoric on human rights?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, the good thing is I'm a cynic, so I wasn't too disappointed when all of those promises didn't play out. And, some of it is that I'm a cynic. Some of it is that, as I don't know if my bio was shared, but, my background is working on US counterterrorism and working on Guantanamo. And you can't work on Guantanamo representing detainees in Guantanamo without being a true cynic. And as very unrelated, but as many of you may know, it remains open 20 years later. And so having that, I lived through the Obama years when many more people were very excited and supportive of what they saw as more progressive foreign policy while Guantanamo remained open, while unlawful military commissions continued. So the fact that the US is being hypocritical, is engaged in realpolitik, those things are not surprising, even though they are continually disappointing to me. In many ways, it would be better if we didn't have the rhetoric, right? We can say many, many terrible things about the Trump administration. President Trump's commitment to bringing Americans home resulted in multiple Americans who were unjustly detained being brought back to the United States. That is a tiny sliver of good, which obviously is not offset by terrible things that happened. But I think it's worth noting that. So I believe in engagement. I don't think you get anything done by not talking to the people you hope to change. But a very simple example would be, you don't meet with a human rights abuser without also meeting with human rights defenders or victims of that same human rights abuser. Biden could have said, of course, I'm going to Saudi Arabia. MBS is hosting this meeting. I'm going to meet with him. And then an hour later, I'm going to meet with human rights defenders, or I'm going to go ask to see a certain prison, or I'm going to meet with the family members and the victims and survivors here in the US, or all of those things, right? Those were all available, and they don't require a disengagement or a refusal to engage. There are a lot of very specific recommendations about weapons and end-use monitoring that I think other people will get into. But in terms of sort of the base diplomatic engagement, the notion that it can only happen in a very narrow, circumscribed way is what I think is problematic. The US must go to this meeting and must shake his hand if he appears, or at least do a fist bump. That's made up. But it's, whatever you think about the US role in the world, Biden's the president of the United States of America. He can make a decision about whose hand he touches, or where he stands on a particular platform, or where he lands, or how long he's somewhere, or what meetings he takes. So the failure to do that is clearly a deliberate choice. And for me, that's the disappointing part. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I also, you mentioned end-use monitoring. I want to get to Joshua's question, which is about, I think in the larger sense, I know he's asking about Afghanistan and Iraq and sort of taking these weapons and making sure that they are somehow stockpiled or secured. But, looking at the policy of the United States, the policy process, this is the fastest I have ever seen weapons I mean, they're literally flying out the door to Ukraine. We are not going to discuss whether that is appropriate or not. That's not our place on this panel. But I do think there is this question about the weapons that have been given to various countries and conflicts in the Middle East over all of these years, and the things that we've seen happen with those weapons, whether they fall into the hands of terrorists, whether they fall into the hands of militias, whether they are used to commit human rights abuses by the regimes that they were given to them, themselves. I was having a meeting with some defense officials the other day about all of these weapons going to Ukraine and sort of saying, I don't think the US really did a good job. And I think that's stating it kind of mildly, thinking about the day after for the weapons that went into Syria. Look at what's happened to all the weapons in Libya. We are constantly tracking at Human Rights Watch and my fellow organizations, these weapons falling into the hands of bad actors. Once you give that weapon to somebody, you cannot control where it goes. Even if you have a scanner that is, there to look at the serial numbers, and even if you have photos of the weapon moving from place to place, eventually you will lose track of that weapon, and you cannot just implode it as Inspector Gadget would have liked to have done. So we're looking at, the officials were telling me, and I believe them, that the policy process for getting the weapons to Ukraine is extraordinarily robust. They're being very, very careful with the weapons that they're sending. They are doing end use monitoring insofar as they can, but even they admit that it's very hard to track. Now let's talk about what's happened in the Middle East and where all of these weapons are going, especially because now we're seeing all of this, continuing, but sometimes increasing security assistance to Saudi and Egypt and others where you absolutely cannot track where they're going. So I don't know, Merve or Nancy, I think Nancy, do you have some things on this that you would like to offer? And then please also offer any other recommendations that you have.
Sure, and it's actually related to this end use certification and its effectiveness and how can we track it. But I think it is like we need to be very careful when we think that this would be like a safeguard for what we call as the preventing the misuse of weapons. First of all, because it is like the definition of what would be a good use of weapons is problematic. And the other part is that there's a lot of harms that are being done right now using drones or cyber attacks and issues that are equally harmful than actually the physical move of weapons. And I just wanted to put this in the background. But as cynical as everyone who is here, but at the same time, I think if that's the case, and even given the framing and the introduction that I gave, that the US would continue to engage with the Middle East, but how to engage, I think there are two opportunities right now that are very specific that we need to be ahead of time rather than be reactive in order to at least mitigate the harm, if not to do something good. First of all, parallel to the JCPOA and assuming hopefully that this deal would be sealed somehow, we are seeing and have been seeing also the military collaboration and coalitions among the other bloc with Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and UAE and Jordan. Now, while this is happening, it's very important that this kind of alliances and coalition should be framed in some formal codified agreement on what is the code for that. We have been seeing reports coming out, like the Wall Street Journal, about the secret meetings of the heads of militaries in Sharm el-Sheikh from those countries, talking about collaboration, mainly talking about a potential regional defense system, maybe aerial system. And we are also seeing, parallel to that, the acquisition of sort of the Air Force or air defense or aerial weaponry, the Saudi Arabia got about 22 Patriot anti-missiles batteries, and KSA and UAE are in the process of getting the thermal high altitude area defense batteries as well. These are all sort of formulating, and there's no transparency, so we don't know to what extent these coalitions are being formed. And the premise of this coalition is that there would be a common collaboration so that anyone who detects any threat, everyone else would be notified. And so far, this agreement or this kind of in the process formulation is based on notification through computer or phone, but not so far into the live data kind of approach of notification. Now, there are problems that are still there because Saudi Arabia does not want to get formally involved in a coalition with Israel. These are all things that are going into the deliberation. First of all, like the problem that we don't know all the information is an issue, but even if we don't know much, we can put ahead what we need to see as safeguards and codified forms of agreements that make sure that such a coalition and such alliances are not done in a way that at the same time, as Merve said, emboldens the countries who are part of these coalitions, because this is very easy to happen. And at the same time, we need to also be very careful and understand. I mean, and this is actually, I'm not seeing this as an alarming thing, but as an opportunity, because this is something still in the formation and it's happening in parallel with the GCPOA. So we can force and stand by very strongly behind such codification and formal agreements in order to make sure less harm to the people and less emboldening of those countries. Parallel to that, in order to ensure that the whole framing of counterterrorism should be scrutinized and should be monitored very closely, because a lot of the killings that happens and a lot of the arrests and a lot of the human rights violations always happen within the framework of counterterrorism. Many of the people who are in jail in Egypt right now, UAE and Saudi Arabia, are framed as terrorists. Now, couple that with such the regional defense system coalition, if that does not get tackled early on and accurately in a way that looks both at the tactics and the laws that are in place, the anti-terror laws in those countries, this will lead to further harm to the people in the country, in the countries that we are talking about. The other opportunity we are having is like the breakthrough that we had in the US last week with the directive on the protection of the Defense Department on the defense of civilian or mitigation of civilian harm by US military. I think this is an opportune moment to make sure that this does not just look at that, but also how is that applied to armies that are supported by the US and arms that are sent to those countries by the US. And I think it's like we're in an early stage to look at the implementation and the accountability that could be associated to such directive, which is something to be applauded and something to be recognized. But in order for it to be effective, we need to link it to that. And I think this is a great opportunity. My final point about if we are to make anything of that, we need to, as we are focusing on government and government relations in the Middle East, we should focus on the people. And it sounds like a cliche, but the reality is with what we're seeing, the coupling, the parallel dynamics that are happening with the Ukraine. It's not just the arms transfers to the Middle East and the oil, but also we have the food shortage, the water scarcity issues is actually contributing to the food shortage. And then we also have the economic decline. Like Egypt, for example, is now having a debt of like 392 billion, 137 of that are external debt. And the economy is in a very fragile state. Imagine a country like Egypt, just with such a fragile economy falling apart. And the implication of that, when you have an emboldened government that doesn't have anything to offer, but to use the security tool. And how would that affect the people? So these are the 3 points that I wanted to make.
Thanks, Nancy. Could you also just walk us through, I mean, it is congressionally legislated that $300 million can be withheld from Egypt, has to be withheld from Egypt if there are human rights abuses that fit a certain, category or quality. Last year, 110, I believe, million was withheld. Are you expecting that to be withheld again? I know that the US government is currently making that determination. Is it clear to you that human rights abuses in Egypt have gotten better enough for this money to go?
Actually not. And I'm very worried that we are seeing right now what we have seen when in 2018, the $195 million were held in military aid, because the case that we are in, case 173, that is put a civil society organization on trial and getting sentenced. And at that time, there were 3 conditions for the $295 million to be released. One is the acquittal of the 43 people who were indicted and sentenced in that case. Second, the reformation or redrawing the main parameters of the NGO law. And finally, taking care of the relationship between the Egypt and North Korea. Now, this was very tenuous. The changes were very cosmetic. They only resolved the part of the case that involved the Americans, whereas until today, civil society in Egypt is still suffering under the very same case. Now, what I'm seeing right now is a parallel to that, because Egypt is putting in place a lot of mechanisms that would show that there is some progress in human rights, particularly because before of holding the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. So they're trying to portray that there's progress both for the COP27 and for the 300 million and other sorts of pressures. But the mechanisms that they're putting in place are in themselves problematic. One of those mechanisms is actually having this the Committee for Pardoning or the Amnesty for Prisoners. The fact that it's framed that way, that it is not about actually reversing the injustice or reversing the lack of rule of law, that such release of prisoners is coming as sort of an amnesty, just something that is being offered occasionally, endowed by the president. It's not a rights-based approach, which makes it more indicative that this is cosmetic, that this is temporary, and you can release 100 prisoners today and then arrest others, more others, either after COP27 or even before or after the 300 million gets released. So that's the point. My problem is not just whether Egypt would do something or not, but even to start with, the mechanisms that are in place are mechanisms that are not conducive for democratic or sort of rule of law and justice to be becoming foundational for the way that these people are being released.
Thanks, Nancy. That's super helpful. Let's pivot a little bit over to Turkey. And Merve, I want to know, certainly your recommendations, please offer us all of the ones that you have considered and passed on to US policymakers. But I just want to ask a question first. Does it matter what happens in Ukraine for Turkey? Or is the international community in the United States, they're already on a train and they're headed that way, and maybe it doesn't even matter where Ukraine ends up? Maybe, can you just talk us through that quickly?
Yeah, I wanted to keep my answers short to this round because I realized we already have only half an hour left, but does it matter what actually happens in Ukraine? I don't think so. Well, particularly for Turkey, the end result, I mean, Turkey actually cares about Ukraine being a state with, territorial integrity. So there's that, and which is exactly why it is neutral. This is not Erdogan trying to get on the good graces of the US or NATO. This is actually something that's in the long-term Turkish interest. But I think really what changed with the Ukraine war is that I think for many of these dictators, including Erdogan, it reinforced this idea that the world is multipolar and that, there is no Western-led rules-based order that we can just, we should be part of or not part of, and that's not really the debate. And we can all just keep on hedging. We're going towards this multipolar world in which it's all every man or woman for themselves. It's this idea has been reinforced by the Ukraine war, and I think that effect is going to be, is going to go way beyond whether or not Ukraine wins or Putin wins, and however that conflict gets resolved. In terms of recommendations, I really do want to keep it short. I think in my first part of my explanation, I made it pretty clear. I think the US should not sell weapons to dictators. I mean, that should be a goal in itself and a policy in itself. If it absolutely must, and I think with the F-16s to Turkey, there's no urgency or no real reason why the US should be doing that right now. So I think they honestly shouldn't be. But if it must to any country, it should make that sale extremely conditional, and not just in terms of end use and monitoring, but these leaders are themselves the unpredictable ones, and we don't know how they're going to use these weapons if they are committing so many human rights abuses in their own countries, and many of them abroad. What's to stop them from continuing to do that with US weapons and money and support? So there should be real conditions with Turkey and the F-16s. We are seeing some of that movement. I mean, there's the US is still a democracy. That's helpful. The fact that Congress has a say in much of these decisions is very helpful. In the case of Turkey, Congress seems to have been apprehensive about this sale so far, especially Senator Menendez. Some other senators have, wavered back and forth. I don't really know actually how they're going to act if the Biden administration brings this sale to Congress's attention finally at some stage. But we know that the House of Representatives is really concerned, and at least one senator is really concerned. So that's, I think, helpful for U.S. policy, in that the Biden administration or any administration can always say that Congress is being a problem. They don't really trust this sale, and so my hands are tied. And in the case of Turkey, I think the administration should use that to its advantage to, I think, delay the sale as much as possible, at least until after the election in Turkey next summer. And it can, Congress can always introduce conditions into the NDAA or pass bills that, ask the administration to certify progress on certain things that these countries have done or have not done. Back in 2018, when the US was really concerned about Turkey being part of the F-35 program at the time, because it had just bought these Russian missile defense systems that were basically aimed at targeting F-35. So people really didn't want Turkey to have the F-35. One of the things that they put into the NDAA was not only the US government sort of tracking this interoperability and whether Russia could use the system to spy on its, on NATO weapons or equipment. One of the other conditions that they had introduced at the time was that there was a US citizen, Pastor Andrew Brunson, who was in jail in Turkey. And senators put in this provision saying that we would like to know what's going on with this prisoner. And until this prisoner is released, we don't think Turkey should be a part of the F-35 program, continue to be part of the F-35 program. Today, we have a bunch of House representatives in the House who have put in some provisions, again, to Turkey's F-16 sale. They are mainly about foreign policy. The main concern is Turkey going to use these new F-16s against Greece, or to, by against Greece, not to start a war, but to violate Greek airspace. I think that's an important consideration, but human rights and the domestic trajectory of the country should also be a similarly high level consideration that both Congress and I think the administration brings into these kinds of deals. And I'll stop there. But
thanks so much, Merve, and thanks to the panelists. I'm jumping in. Sarah unfortunately had to go deal with picking up her child from school, so bad timing, but she has empowered me to jump in here, and I want to thank everybody for continuing along. We are running towards the last, I'd say, 10-15 minutes of this, and I'd like to just remind people to now, if you want to put questions in the Q&A, to please do so, and you can actually, as an audience member, upvote questions. You should be able to, so can see what are the most important ones to you in your minds. There is a question there about the arms trade treaty. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to take that up. If not, I can do so briefly. But I wanted to pick up where Merve left off in terms of what Congress could do. So it's sort of a two-part question, and Sarah was WhatsApping me with what she wanted to ask next. So I'm gonna take that on. If Andrea or Nancy, if you're seeing things Congress has considered, or you think they should consider that relate to the arms trade, but also human rights. I think one of the questions in this is, what are you hoping would be indicators of change within a country that would make it a place where we feel like there is progress on the human rights angle? There is progress where a more integrated arms relationship would actually make sense, rather than what we have today, which doesn't seem to accomplish the goals that you all are talking about being there. So a couple of questions, sort of anybody want to talk about the ATT, but also Congress, there's something in Congress, and what is it that you're looking for? I think Merve started us off well down that path of some of the specifics she talked about that had been introduced in the past around the F-35s to Turkey back in the day. But now, there are a number of NDA provisions right now, and there's other things going on. So Andrea or Nancy, do you want to jump in on any of those?
I'm happy to jump in on the ATT, not because I'm an expert on it, but because I think it's consistent with our conversation about realpolitik, which is that policy always trumps law. So the ATT exists, the DSCA spends time, everyone attempts to comply with it. But the reality is similar to Leahy law. I mean, you can point to tons of human rights abusers that still get US assistance. It is important for the US to have a robust legal structure that limits weapons and US funds going to human rights abusers. It's important that these laws be complied with, but there's always a way to nuance it. So I don't think that it is perceived as a significant constraint when it comes to some of these sales. But I know, Jeff and others are much more experts in the details, so happy to defer on that. But as we saw, there's another question in the chat on, is human rights centered foreign policy a viable alternative to realpolitik? I mean, in my view, yes. I think that human rights centered foreign policy is what foreign policy should be. A state exists to improve the lives of its citizens, and I think that should extend to citizens of the world. I also think that we as Americans benefit from a free and democratic global environment, and I think one could argue that's realpolitik. I mean, that's exclusively in the U.S. interest to not have countries fall apart. The problem, in my view, is that the people who are doing the assessment. So some people might say, Israel needs to remain as supported as it can be in the region, and that might mean dealing with Saudi Arabia in order to get its support on the Abraham Accords. That's a security issue. Same conversation with respect to Egypt as a security issue. But when you look at what's happening inside those countries and you see domestic human rights abuses, which actually destabilize those countries, I think people are making the wrong assessment. So I don't actually think that there's necessarily an inconsistency between having a human rights centered foreign policy and being, realistic, to not use the IR term, and being practical. It's just that the people making the decisions are choosing not to look at the reality of the situation. I think they look at sort of the top level, sort of see and hear what they want to see and hear, and don't look behind it, or look behind it only for the very short term and not the longer term.
Nancy, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, just a quick thing is I think, as Andrea said, the laws are there. I mean, many directives are there that in theory should govern human rights and the prohibition of use of U.S. arms and or support for countries that are like committing human rights abuses. But as long as we're not seeing real examples of such implementation, this is all just going to remain within the realm of theory. And I think a good thing to start with, I mean, if we can't be so ambitious that things will change, is that we pick on particular issues that are very significant. And first of all, the special treatment of Israel in the region is like so-called in the past is the only democracy in the region. This is something that needs to have a different approach for dealing with it. Just picking one thing. I mean, accountability for the death of Shireen Abu Akleh. That is something, it's just pointing out to that is very important. The closure and the harassment of NGOs and civil society in Israel is also another thing that is not actually very different than what's happening in the rest of the region. It's just like very symptomatic of what's happening in the rest of the region. So I think on just like having a list of particular cases that we need to put on as a top of the list to tackle, to give an example of what accountability looks like, because right now there isn't any. Even like I'm with the $300 million being withheld from aid to Egypt, I don't think even the conditions that are there for the release of the money is realistic or indicative of any real change. I believe that going back, unfortunately, to realpolitik is that we should have an integration of such demands with current arrangements, security arrangements that are being set in the region, and we push for it. The current coalitions that are happening, the arrangement, the regional, the potential regional defense system that they are building together, these are all things that are in the formation where we do have a chance to attach to them some specific conditions that would be safeguards for human rights at that point. Other than that, I think it would be more of tokenization and would actually lead to the perpetuating the system as it is. It's just like releasing a few prisoners and then saying that this is progress, and then after the money is released, like we arrest them again. It's just that's the problem with it.
Great, thank you. I guess I'll add some thoughts in here. And Andrea, I wonder if you or your organization has any thoughts on the Yemen War Powers Resolution. So turning back to the congressional possibilities, there are a number of things that have been written into the House version of the NDAA that would require much greater understanding, much greater transparency about the arms trade. Better end use monitoring, I think, is also a piece of this, but those would all be very helpful in the Middle East as well. There is a separate effort for Congress to assert its authority in terms of whether we're supporting a war in Yemen, and if we are, then Congress needs to authorize that. So that's the Yemen War Powers Resolution. So there are a number of steps Congress can take. One of the things that also could be done is Congress could use its 502B abilities to ask the State Department to make sense of some of these arms transfers or some of these deals. If we have questions about the potential release of security assistance to Egypt, to these arms sales to Saudi Arabia, to what's happening with Turkey, Congress could ask for a report, and it could start a process that it never uses, but it is empowered. And I think some of the panelists are saying there is good law in place, but we don't use it. And I think Congress could take the step to start using some of the possibilities that it has. I'll say, just to talk a little bit about the arms trade treaty, since Neil Cooper asked about this. I was not at the Conference of States Parties last week, where there was at least one side event on Ukraine, and I don't know what the conversation was like. I think it's an open question about what impact the arms trade treaty itself is having on the war in Ukraine. What I think would be valuable for states parties is to have to explain their rationale for what they're doing, why they're sending the weapons, but also what mitigating factors they are taking in terms of keeping track of the weapons, making sure they're not used improperly. And whatever they identify is what they are positively trying to do to overcome all the harms and risks that we always see with the war. Those are the things that we can apply then to the Middle East. Those are the things that when we talk about, if we're going to be sending weapons and assistance to a certain country, what have we done in Ukraine to make sure that's done in a safe way? how can we be doing that and taking those same considerations in mind in other countries? So I still think the arms trade treaty is relevant. Obviously, the United States under the Trump administration tried to unsign this, and I think we're all waiting for the Biden administration to re-endorse it, because there's nothing in the treaty itself that indicates counter to US law. And I do think it's problematic for the world's largest arms dealer to not be agreeing to at least those standards with the arms trade treaty, that we should be considering these factors when we make arms sales. So the treaty continues on. There was a conference of states parties last week. As far as I know, the United States has still not indicated it's planning to rejoin or re-sign, but I think those are steps that could be taken. I think we may be running into the last 10 minutes here. I don't see any new questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So maybe I will just do a quick round and ask each of our panelists if they have any 1 minute of final thoughts, and then I think we'll close from there. And maybe we'll go in reverse order from what we've been doing, and go to Merve, Nancy, and then Andrea. And someone just put something in the chat. If it's relevant, I'll try to say something, but let me turn it over back to you all.
I tried to quickly read the last comment, but my box is closed. Okay, so I guess like finally, as a final thought, I would just, reiterate, I don't think through arms sales we can change the way dictators behave in terms of how they devise their foreign policy. All of these countries that we've been talking about, none of them are really supportive of the Ukraine war. As in any way. I mean, they're pretty neutral countries when it comes to that war. It's not like they, have been, extremely supportive of Ukraine or helping Ukraine defend itself, and they therefore deserve some rewards or whatever. I think their foreign policies have not really been praiseworthy, and I think their domestic behavior has not changed. I mean, in Turkey's case, there hasn't even been cosmetic changes to the human rights situation like that we've seen in Egypt, and so not even that window dressing or anything like that. So it's really problematic to, I think, try to make these big arms deals and have these fist bump meetings and all of that, as if that's going to have these countries turn suddenly pro-American or democratic or in any way. So framing it, framing the issue as autocrats versus Democrats, and then recruiting these people into that, I think is a losing game. And if the US wants to engage, I mean, it has aid relationships with many of the countries in the Middle East. With Turkey, it doesn't, but it has this F-16 sale. It will always have, I mean, the US is still the most powerful country in the world. It has the best technology, especially military technology. These countries will always want US arms and weapons, right? And so I think the US should, use that as an advantage to try to push for some good in this world and try to nudge these leaders towards, small, even if it's small, some changes that can really help these countries in the long run fix their human rights record, turn towards democracy. There was a time that, that policy was working in the world, and I would really like for us to go back to that dynamic and have the US play a more robust, active role in promoting human rights and democracy, including through these arms deals and diplomatic engagement, and not see these things as separate fields, separate levels, none of that, but have a more holistic picture.
Just like final words, is recapping what I was saying, is just like we need to stop the way we perceive the Middle East, and which has a lot of consequences of how we engage with the Middle East. And we need to have an approach that is focused on structural changes, rather than thinking that there is either a special incident or a special circumstance that we need to take care of, ISIS or whatever, or a special figure that's going to change things. It's like if we've seen over the years, starting at least in the past 10 years, it's like Obama taking down bin Laden, and then Trump taking down Bukhari and Qasem Soleimani, and then Biden taking down Zawahiri. I mean, taking down those trophies or people just as a symbolic way, I mean, that's fine, but they're not going to change anything. and putting out the perception that taking down these leaders is the way to actually make change in the Middle East and hence improve the situation is a huge of like more, I would say, like all smoke and mirrors, as they say, because at the end of the day, the fundamental grievances and challenges in the region that are particularly caused by the leaders that are corrupt, that are not held accountable, that are not having any forms of oversight over the way of their governance, and at the same time being emboldened by the US is only leading to further deterioration of the situation. And the US will end up and will continue to engage with the Middle East. The question is how, and I think the direction, at least, I mean, I don't have the panacea for the problems of the Middle East or even the way the US engages, but at least there is a direction for structural changes and taking opportunities as what we are seeing right now. We're seeing like two main opportunities. Well, what's happening with the JCPOA and the formation of the processes that come around it and could just sort of being formulated around it is very crucial. And as things are being formed, we have a lot of room to make change and put in some codification of the agreements and the alliance that are being made. And second, taking opportunities like what we've seen last week with the directive of the Department of Defense on the mitigation of civilian harms and associating and linking that to the use of arms in the Middle East.
Thank you,
So
Nancy
just used a great phrase, taking down those terrorists. The US, of course, says bringing to justice. And we haven't talked specifically about the impact of US foreign policy on the populations where the US engages in its own abusive foreign policy and what sort of modeling that means. But I always find that phrase so frustrating, the idea that justice is killing someone from abroad with a drone, and that's something, the justice component should be celebrated. The fact that, evil people are not able to conduct evil anymore is great, but that notion that that's justice is so deeply troubling. So I'm going to end not with summarizing what I said, but bringing up a new point that will be brief, which is one thing we haven't discussed, which is really the American people. Biden talked about having a foreign policy for the middle class, sort of bringing foreign policy to the middle class, but it's not about finding out what Americans want and then implementing it in foreign policy. It's about saying, we brought you lower oil prices, or your life is better because of this engagement. And part of what I think is missing deeply from Washington, and always has been in foreign policy, is the perspectives of voters. They're not relevant to almost all US foreign policy. So that leaves politicians to decide what they think is best. Now, we can argue whether that's better or worse. Sometimes it's better for leaders to make what they think are good decisions. Sometimes it's not. But if you support democracy, you believe that there should be some kind of engagement. So on issues, Jeff mentioned war powers resolution. That is something where members of Congress actually get constituent phone calls on. That is one of the very few foreign policy issues where they will ever get constituent phone calls. So they make the decisions they want to make for their own political reasons, for their own personal, moral, and ethical reasons, for business reasons, deeply connected to weapon sales, of course, business reasons, but not because they are concerned about how voters will respond. And I think until that changes, we will have this disconnected foreign policy that is purely dependent on who is in power when it comes to the administration and who is in power in Congress if they feel the need to try to curtail administration action. I don't think that's the way that the system should function. And I think that if we had true engagement from voters and other interested parties in the United States, because not everyone needs to be a voter to care what the US does, then we might see a more realistic conversation about the implications of US foreign policy, instead of what remains a sort of inside the beltway, elitist conversation that has a significant impact on the lives of millions, many outside the US, but also on the lives of people inside the United States. So that's my vision of the future that might bring us back to where, not back, where I think this country should be, although obviously there's no guarantee that would lead to better policy, but I think it's worth a try. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrea. This might not be the last in a series of events. I want to thank CI, the Center for International Policy, and Nancy for co-hosting this event. The war in Ukraine is clearly changing the world. And part of the reason for having this event was to see what that has meant in the Middle East, both how the Middle East is impacting on the war, but also how the war is impacting on the Middle East. And I think we've covered a good deal of that in terms of the way the US has changed its engagement or gone back to a previous type of pattern, or not changed in any meaningful way. But I think this war in Ukraine is going to have knock-on effects around the world. And we talked about that as well. And I think the arms trade is going to be expanding greatly as we think of problems and try to come with solutions that require more weapons. And I'm hoping that some of the ideas that you heard today are ideas where we can avoid that type of future. So I want to thank Nancy, Andrea, and Merve for joining us. Everyone, thank you for joining in on this. As you exit, if you could please fill out the survey so we know how it went. The video of this event is available online. And with that, I want to say thank you.